Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Brian O podcast. Once again, joined with Joe Chislett from Kritikos. We are on our second episode, which is really exciting that we're continuing to march forward with the podcast. Last week, if you weren't able to watch or listen and follow along, what we talked about was the value of critical thinking and uncertain decision-making scenarios, and not everything being a fact or opinion. And we introduced a concept called the judgment. And what we're going to do today is really explore how judgments show up in different scenarios to really raise your awareness of what that looks like in reality. So hopefully you can start to spot these situations along the way. And, just to throw it out there, follow, like, subscribe to the podcast. We are just getting started and looking for more followers. Also, we'll have a link to Joe's website, Kritikos, in the comments, so you can check his website out and see more about what he does. With all that in mind, Joe, welcome back. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing good. I think I like this dichotomy of the expert on the show with the collar, and I'll keep the hoodie on so that I can maintain my position of I'm the sales guy and kind of just, shallow and fast moving as depth of knowledge. And
Yeah. Or you could say the uptight Brit and the kind of laid back American.
yeah, no, it's a super chill time in the States. So yeah, it's all cool vibes over here. Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in on all this, Joe. We were just kind of doing some prep before, and I know you have a lot of different things you want to dive into and stories. So I just let you kind of jump in with where you want to go, or if you wanted to touch on a couple of topics from last week, just to make sure that they're sharp and everyone's ready to get ready to kind of dive in on the content.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, I think I will just do a try and keep it quick kind of recap of sort of the key ideas, just to make the sort of logic flow into what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, we're talking about the sort of value of critical thinking, and I link it up to just an honest account of an honest picture of how our minds actually work, and the fact that we have all these ideas and thoughts kind of flying around and bubbling up, and that we don't really have control over, but we do have control over which ones we take out into the world. And not only do we have sort of the option to take to apply that control, but actually we have I was suggesting that we have a duty to do that, really, because to society and to other people, and not just to ourselves, that you don't just go with your first impulse all the time. And I just thought it occurred to me during the week, like a way of illustrating this. By getting into critical thinking, it doesn't mean you don't have these kind of like thoughts yourself. I still don't control what my mind comes up with. And a good way of illustrating it is that when I'm writing my exam questions, some of them are like purely analytical, and it's asking people to identify a conclusion or an assumption that's being made by an argument, which incidentally is it's harder than it sounds, because it's asking you to identify something that isn't actually on the page or on the screen. It's something that needs to be true for the argument to work. So it's an analytical skill, but it's quite high level, and we might at some point we might look at that. But yeah, so there's the purely analytical questions, but there are also ones which are asking people, say, like, which of the following is a flaw in the above argument. So I have to kind of present them with a flawed argument, but I don't deliberately sit down and write like. Sometimes I do, but often, I don't sit down and I'm going to write a bad argument. What I do is I just write an argument. I write the first argument I think of. Quite often I might just be listening to something on the radio or a podcast or something, and I have a thought and I go, oh, that probably means that. And then I go, oh, yeah, that's a clever thought, Joe. And then I go, hang on a minute, is that am I really happy with that? Does that really follow? And I realize maybe it doesn't. And then I think, there's my little flawed argument I'm going to give people to try and identify the flaw. So I'm just a way of kind of like illustrating that this is just a natural way of us thinking, is that our minds fire out ideas all the time. And thank God they do, really. We don't want to stop that. That's where all our kind of creativity and possibilities and imagination comes from. But it's just having some sort of sense of product, like quality control of what you actually take out into the world. So yeah, the aim is a little bit more control and hopefully better judgments and decisions in the face of uncertainty. That's the idea. And I thought I'd just also make another little addition here. I felt like I wanted to just just add a slightly more optimistic note, because last time I was really hammering this idea that we just don't know stuff, and this stuff you can never know, no matter how much like critical thinking you've done. Actually, if you do think well from good foundations, you can venture a bit further into the unknown and stay on solid ground. And you probably can increase the radius of the stuff that you know. You know, you can increase the boundaries of the frontiers of knowledge. I actually think that happens through a combination of creative and critical thinking. That's how science progresses, as we'll maybe talk about some point. But it's not all doom and gloom. We can go somewhere with our thinking if we're careful, and it can give us more security and accuracy. But there is that trade-off I mentioned. You know, like it will slow you down thinking a bit. So what we're looking at today is ways that just very quickly, intuitively adding a little bit of critical thinking into what you're doing in the middle of a sort of real-time conversations, just by applying this concept of judgment.
So I want to kind of just go back into a couple of those points because you said
Sure.
a lot of very good things, and it's worth mentioning. I feel like that's the general predisposition for Brits is kind of the doom and gloom, a little bit, right? A little bit of that. So everything we're really talking about is making choices to put yourself into better situations. I think that's one of the key benefits of being able to weigh information is you don't just go with your first instinct. You have to be able to filter your thoughts. You have to be able to weigh out the trade-offs of making a choice. You mentioned duty of control is something you just said. So I think that's super important, and where like a judgment, like how that works, and why it's important. And then also what you do and what your career has been writing these challenging questions to really draw out people's ability to think and process through challenging arguments and test prep and those types of things. So I don't know if you have an example you want to go into later there, but that might be interesting to explore
Mm.
one of those questions.
Okay. Yeah,
And then,
sure. I mean, I
I
was editing them all day yesterday, so they're
yeah, there
always
we go. So
yeah.
if you had one handy, that might be fun to dive in. But I don't want to give the answers away for all your potential students either. That might be bad. Anyways,
No,
yeah.
um, yeah, I just actually that's reminded me of one more thing, as you were saying about just one more thing I'd like to add before we get into the judgment thing is, like what's when it comes to sort of making decisions and making choices, as you say, you know, and whether or not and how much to think and how much to weigh stuff up. One thing to ask is like, what's the alternative? And the
Mm.
alternative is just going with your impulse or instinct or intuition. Now, I've got a bit more time for intuition and instinct than probably your average critical thinking person. And that'll probably come out more in maybe future episodes. But I don't know if I just couldn't resist talking about this. I don't know if you have the show Traitors in America, but it's
Uh,
big.
we, we do. I'm not a big TV guy, but it's my daughter loves the show. She tells me
Right.
about it all the time, and I had no
Okay.
idea.
Yeah. My kids love it. We watch it as a family, actually. Yes. I mean, I'm not a huge, I'm going to say this now, not a huge reality TV fan. I sometimes find them a bit exploitative, but there are a few I get really drawn into. I just can't help it. And this is one of them. And I think because it's about people, for me, it's almost like a test case of people surrounded by uncertainty, having to make judgments and decisions about who to evict from this house, whether or not they think they're lying or if they're a traitor or a faithful. And it's just really interesting watching people's thought processes, watching people justify the decisions, and they don't have a lot to go on. And you realize that there a lot of the time they are just going on instinct and intuition, and they admit that, which is fine. But one thing that, I really noticed watching the recent sort of series in the UK one, well, for a start, you had a couple of people who really prided themselves on having trained instincts and intuitions. You had a former like police detective and things who had so much kind of confidence in her ability to sort of sniff out, liars,
Yeah.
and she was hopelessly wrong. In fact, the people who performed better than her, I thought, were that I kind of like the young 22-year-old like Muslim guy from the Asian guy from the north of England, who just was had a much better he had a much better feel for like well, these people, these young kids who seem to be doing better just on the pure intuition thing. And then the other thing is you notice is that the people who go into with absolute certainty, they said, I just know you're a traitor. I just know it. And they
Hmm.
make their judgment and then they turn out to be wrong. And this poor person gets evicted because the group of people as a group, like herded together and went with absolute certainty. And instead of then going, oh, do you know what? Maybe we'd better not trust our instinct next time because it was so wrong. But they go in the next time with the absolute the same level of certainty and get it wrong again. And I thought it's like, in a way, one of the problems with intuition and things, even though it's very honestly, I will be talking about its value at some point, is that I felt like what it doesn't do is that it doesn't. It's two things really. One, it's not accountable in the same way, and it because people just say, well, it was just my gut. I had to go with my gut, right? Sorry. And the other thing is it doesn't really learn in the same way. I thought maybe those two things are connected. The fact that it's not accountable allows it to keep going ahead, making these, and it's not really learning or improving. So, that's people who pride themselves on having strong intuitions and things.
Yeah.
I'm slightly skeptical of that because I feel like it's you wonder how much they've really tracked the amount of times they're getting it right, and sort of, and revised that accordingly.
Let me
Um,
jump in real quick on a couple of things. So you mentioned there's, a police officer who's professionally trained in figuring things out and making these calls, and then they're observably worse than just a young person who's, just showing up into the world, we'll call it, in their 20s, right? Um, what do you attribute that to?
okay, well there are various kind of explanations for that, and some of them would take a little bit of time to go into. But one answer is simply kind of like I've already given, that you're not. It doesn't learn in the same way. So new experiences don't necessarily, like, you're getting the feedback that you were wrong, but you don't then adjust. And I think that when people get more confident in their role and more confident in their expertise, they can sometimes become almost overconfident in their own instinct and intuition.
Yeah.
So it doesn't. Um, but yeah, there are more complicated answers that we could explore another time, maybe.
Yeah, no, that
That
makes a lot of
answers it.
sense. I think people do have sometimes blind confidence that they're right, and despite better immediate evidence and proof, they'll anchor down onto whatever their first instinct was, which kind of goes back to the original point
Yeah,
of,
I think
you know,
there are,
yeah,
as we'll talk about another time, there are areas where intuition does get sharper and more accurate with practice and over
yeah,
time. So
yeah. I'm
let's leave it
excited
at
to
that
get
for
into
now.
that. I'm excited to get into that topic. So why don't we keep going down, the road of judgment, and
Mhm.
I know you had a couple of other topics you wanted to kind of introduce, and again, just kind of keep, um, you know, showcasing how judgment shows up beyond reality TV shows. Although I'd like to maybe get on there.
But
Yeah,
that's what makes it such entertaining viewings. So, all right. So, what do I? So, I felt like we should just sort of explain a bit more about what I mean by judgment, and then sort of apply it a little bit, and maybe take away, sort of extract from it how it's helpful, why it's helping us. I sort of described it last time as occupying a zone between fact and opinion. It's not the only thing that lies in that zone, but we're looking at things that have features of each. So a judgment, so if we think of facts as things which are sort of like certain, actively true, um, and that means that if you kind of like, you can be right or wrong about them. If you mislabel the capital city or something, there is a correct answer about which one it is. And okay. Um, and then you think about opinions as kind of being like subjective, that, there is no real truth. They're not right or wrong. They are each to their own. And you think about a judgment, you know, judgments are open to debate and discussion, and there are different judgments that you could make in a situation. So unlike facts, which are kind of fixed and certain, and you've got there are different judgments that are valid. But unlike opinions, they can be better or worse. They can be right or wrong sometimes. So what they have elements of each, but they also have something that they neither facts nor opinions have, which is uncertainty. because facts, a fact is a fact by definition. And opinions, in a funny kind of way, have a certainty about them. You say, "Well, that's my opinion." You know what your opinion is. It'll give you some evidence. It's not going to. You can't change. If somebody say, "Well, I like this. This is my favorite flavor of crisps." Okay, well, well, I think I've found 7 people who disagree with you. It's a completely irrelevant.
Right.
I could write a book on why this other flavor is better. It's not going to change. It's got no it isn't- you have. It doesn't force you to rethink. So opinions have a kind of like certainty about them as well, in a way. And it's this middle area of judgment where there's uncertainty and an element of risk involved, because you're sort of, you're sticking your neck out in a way that you're not doing when you're just saying, well, that's just my opinion. Because with a judgment, you're prepared to be, you're saying something that may turn out to be better, worse, right, wrong, that kind of thing. And the best way is just to like give a couple of illustrations quickly, like paradigm examples would be something like, I think I mentioned last time, like a kind of a GP, like a doctor giving you their sort of diagnosis. You go along with a certain kind of physical symptoms, you're worried about something, and they say, I don't think that's anything actually, I don't think that's anything that serious. I don't think you need to worry about that. What they're saying, it's not a matter of fact. They may be wrong, and they sometimes are. But at the same time, it's not just a matter of opinion that's purely subjective to them. And then, like if another doctor disagree, one of them's going to be right and the other one's going to be wrong. Both of their opinions are equally subjective, equally valid. So you both have and don't have the disease. It just doesn't make any sense. And then a kind of more sort of like less technical, like everyday level, like a parent making a judgment about what their child should or shouldn't be allowed to do. Yeah, again, it's not a matter of fact. Different parents might have different takes on that, and there might be valid reasons for each. But at the same time, it's not just a matter of opinion, in that some decisions you make, you know, you decide to give your child a diet of pure junk food. It's probably not a good one. It's probably not a good judgment. There are better and worse judgments that you can make, and you might not know at the time. That's why it's scary, of course. Being a parent, like you don't know what the consequences are going to be exactly of your decisions, and you're sort of winging it. But you know that some of the decisions and judgments and decisions you make are going to be better and worse for the child than others. Hence the responsibility, hence why it's important. So you got 2 examples there of things that I'd call a judgment rather than a fact or opinion. And they both have an element of uncertainty. So I hope that sort of illustrates a little bit by what the kind of thing, I mean, of course, they're different kinds of judgment. One's more about a matter of whether or not a kind of, a sort of fact about the world, whether or not you've got a particular condition. And the other's more about like what's going to enable a child to flourish, or what's a kind of good or bad parenting. So one's got a bit more kind of value judgments going on, but they're both somewhere in that zone of uncertainty. And by the way, not only judgments that belong there. I mean, I think things like there's a lot of stuff, the more as we talk about it more, a lot of things belong in this middle zone, sort of theories, models, hypotheses, explanations, recommendations, predictions, strategies, proposals, you name it. There's a lot of stuff that's going to go in there.
I
Um,
And I think it's great to highlight all those other things because, I don't want to pigeonhole this. It's either fact, opinion, or judgment. There's a whole range of things, but I do think that a lot of people sit in this fact and opinion mode, and we argue on the internet all day of, is that a
mhm,
fact or not, and it's an opinion or
yes.
not, and
Mhm,
like that is everywhere. So this whole concept of there's a lot more about, these are choices that need to be made. There's different kind of approaches or categories or buckets of what they could be, and those types of structures and how you work through those is again kind of what you do day in and day out, helping people learn about this. You've written about it, but I think those are the skills that if you can kind of really be able to systematically weigh out and work through those internally and with the team. I look at everything from a business lens because I think there's a lot of, what you're talking
mm,
about with uncertainty and risk is like risk management 101. You're a business leader trying to, you know, which strategy do we want to take with everyone's talking about AI. So what strategy do we want to take with AI? And, a common one is, do I want to develop the stuff in house or do I want to buy someone else's? And I talk to people all day long about what makes sense for them and I help work through those. But that's a tangible, real challenge that a lot of leaders are struggling with right now.
Mhm.
So just to kind of tie that back to another, application like real time today, being able to weigh out all those and make choices that
Mm.
will put you in a risky spot. And it's a business. It's like, are we going to get a lawsuit or not? Everyone has their own risk tolerance. Everyone has their own risk profile, plus their own decision making framework. It's a really complex topic, but for me, it always comes back to the person who has to make that choice needs the skills and the mechanics to be able to just properly evaluate what's going on in their world, and they can only see what information they understand, and have access to. So like, you're familiar with those and like being able to explore all of those and bring those in. So I'll throw that in as yes, and all those other things beyond judgments. Like this is ultimately what we're trying to help get into our listeners and anybody who's watching. Like this is what ultimately these skills translate into from like a career development standpoint and application in your daily life. And you can hopefully take what Joe mentioned and kind of that and be able to, apply it into your own context. I always like to go use cases, but everyone has their own best stuff. So if there's
Mm.
different topics or anything like that, throw that in the comments. I'm going to be the YouTube guy. I watch my kids watch YouTube all day. So I know that you got to like smash the like button and all that other stuff, Joe. So that's my job here. But anyways, I don't mean to derail you.
I mean, you're right to try and sort of link it to people's actual context a bit more. And I thought I'd probably give a business scenario that I sometimes use in like workshops and things to sort of illustrate it a bit more, because I'm worried that people might be just thinking, oh, what? So what? So basically, you're saying that there's difficult stuff I have to do called making decisions. Yeah, I know that, and I know I can't just Google them. I know they're not just things you can just Google. I know that they're more than just or just toss a coin. I've got to put some thought into it, and they might be right or wrong. But I think you've got to start somewhere. My first starting point is recognizing where judgments are taking place a bit more before we look at how to really sort of start sharpening up the judgments we make. Just seeing the world more in terms of judgments, being more alert to where they're going on. And I want to sort of show you, illustrate the example, why I think it's helpful. And like you said at the beginning, like a lot of sort of wasted time arguments on the internet online, a lot of them, I think a lot of it could be reduced by not trying to force things into kind of fact and opinion boxes. So here's an example I give. It's a sort of imagined scenario of a salesperson reporting back. And they say, I've just been to see the clients. Basically, they're unanimously in favor of sticking with the current deal. There's no way we can get them to budge. Okay. And that's their report. And I say to people, okay, they've made two statements there, right? If you were going to try and put them in the fact and opinion, if you had to try and put them in the fact and opinion boxes, what people would probably do, what I'd probably do, I guess, is I'd put the first one into that sort of fact box. They were unanimously in favor. That's, something that happened. And then there's no way of getting them to budge. Whoa, that's a bit more like an opinion. That's probably what you'd do if you were thinking with your fact and opinion head on. But you might feel a slight anxiety about that. And you'd be right to, because as we'll see in a minute, I don't think that's the right analysis. What people do in the real world is that in a real-time conversation, you've got to make an instant assessment. And so you end up going, you have to end up going on things like whether you trust this person, how much do you like them? You end up having to go with your instinct. And you probably feel a little bit like, oh, I'm not 100% sure I should trust that, but I've got no choice. I've got to one way or the other. And you either go binary, you either go, yeah, all right, they know what they're talking about, let's go with it. Or don't trust them at all, they're probably lying or mistaken. And what I would say is I hear something like that and I just think, okay, that's your judgment. So if we just sort of revisit the claims. So the second claim, let's start with the second one, that it's going to, it'll be impossible. There's no way we're going to get them to budge. That's the one which we thought, hang on, like opinion, you don't know that. Yeah, he doesn't know that because it's about the future and people don't know the future. But it's calling it an opinion isn't quite right because either it's going to be true or not. You could test it and you could find out, and you persevere and they don't budge, in which case it was the correct prediction, or you try a bit harder and they do budge, in which case it turned out to be wrong. So it's not just a matter of opinion whether or not they'll budge or not. In fact, because it's a claim about the future, we'd be better off calling it a prediction. And a prediction is a perfect example of something that it's sort of between fact and opinion, because it's not a fact yet because it's about the future. It hasn't happened, but it's not just a matter of opinion because it either will or won't. I think I gave the example of the weather forecast last week,
Yeah.
and they say this is going to happen. They might get it wrong. They don't know, in the sense, you don't know the future, but so it's not a fact, but at the same time, it's more than just an opinion, partly because it's based on a huge amounts of like knowledge and evidence and data, and partly because it's going to turn out, if you say it's going to rain tomorrow at 6 o'clock in this place, you go and stand there and it does, you were right. And somebody said it wasn't going to, was wrong. So if we sort of rewind a little bit to the other claim the person made that we put in the fact box, or we thought maybe goes in the fact box, the clients were unanimously in favor of sticking with the point. I mean, are we happy with that being in a fact box? Why, if you ask why it might possibly not belong there, if we're trying to see things more as a matter of judgment, maybe that's a candidate, something that we could sort of say, hang on a minute, how does this person know that they're unanimously in favor of it? I mean, have they just said it because, for one thing, have they just said it because they just want to make a decision and they want to move on? And have they just said it to persuade me to go with them? Like they might not be being 100% truthful, number one, but even if we assume they are, how do they know what the clients are unanimous? I mean, like, did they take a vote? Did what? What was the context where it happened? Did they count the hands? What about the people who didn't? Or did they just kind of sense it? Quite often, they may have just sensed it. It might have been a kind of hunch, a feeling they got, and very likely, what they made was a judgment. They made a judgment on the mood, comments made, that sort of thing. Also, were the people being truthful? The people who he was asking being truthful themselves? I mean, maybe they were giving the answer that they had been told to give, and then say it individually, they might have given a different answer. So what started off like in the kind as a kind of sort of sounded like pretty certain, like a kind of fact, you start to think about it a little bit more. Not so sure. And so this comes back to my mottos, trying to see things more in terms of judgments rather than facts and opinions. We're basically being a bit more perceptive about cases of not knowing, realizing there's more not knowing going on than you might have at first have thought. So you're being a bit more perceptive about cases of not knowing and of different ways that people can not know. So you can not know the future. There's a different way of not knowing than not knowing what's going on in a bunch of people's heads inside of a room. In both cases, you don't know, but there's slightly different ways of not knowing. One's a prediction, one that is a kind of what we could call it, a kind of description of other people's thoughts or something like that. And they both need to be treated slightly differently.
So yeah, I think that scenario, well, it is something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is really grilling a salesperson about why they're not hitting the deals or why things fell through and how we could improve. Those are questions that I'll ask, like, are you sure about that? Or like, what really happened? Or who made the call? Was it the decision maker saying this, or was it just another person? So those are ways that I've inspected salespeople. So I love that example because it just is something that, as a sales leader, I've done many, many times. And you do find that there's, assumptions in there. There are, sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't actually know what's going on. I'm just going to say the deal's dead because I didn't do my job upstream. So they're covering for their own selves. If, you know, I've been through that scenario many, many times. So I like that example a lot. And I think it really illustrates just how a couple of firm, confident statements can be, can take them as, well, that's that, and be done with it. Or if you really look and inspect it a little bit more and know how to go into that, you're going to be able to find more information. And from a sales perspective, I would hope you're able to, reignite that opportunity, or maybe call in the boss and cut a special deal to get them across the finish line. So there's the sales guy in me coming out. But either way, that I love that example, and I think that really makes sense to me. So
Okay, well that's cool. I'm afraid I've got a few more things to say about it because it is such a I mean, I've named my business. I said last week, Kritikos is kind of named after the ancient Greek word for judge.
hmm
It's so central. I think that it's the gateway to critical thinking. I really do. Sort of recognizing this idea of judgments and recognizing where they're being made. So I'm just going to zip through a few more reasons why I think it's good and helpful. I know there's loads of virtues in seeing things more in terms of judgments. So, like, you save time and emotional energy that you otherwise waste on trying to argue whether something's a fact or not, or worrying about whether or not it's a fact, or worrying about how someone can know something or not when they claim to know it. You just go, chill. It's a judgment. Okay, they've made a judgment. Okay, so and then you go, okay, we're in that zone of judgment. It may be right, it may be wrong. Let's think of the reasons for it. You know, regardless, you're kind of defusing. You're taking out the emotional thing of like the person seems really confident or the person seems really shaky. You just go. Don't be swayed by that. They've made a judgment. Let's treat it as a judgment. It also kind of reduces, I think, like the friction, like we sort of alluded to earlier, like people trying to arguing about whether or not trying to put thing in, sort of grind something into a box that it doesn't belong in. You're like forcing it into a fact box, or just calling it's just an opinion, and people get very, well, it's not just my opinion. Yes, it is. Blah 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 blah. Well, it's not a fact. Yes, it is. Blah 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 blah. Look, again, just chill. It's a judgment, right? We've made a judgment, and in thinking of a judgment, you're not going to buy into it 100%. You're going to respect it, but it gives you that kind of critical distance. You realize that by definition, it's something that might be mistaken, it might be wrong. So it kind of gives you that sort of like critical distance, stops you just like going in too hard, buying into it too quickly. It's also it sparks your curiosity because you think something there may be reasons why if something is a judgment, that means it's probably been based on something. I wonder what it's been based on. Let's find out. Let's have a look. Let's explore it. Incidentally, we'll be looking at next time sharing thinking. You want to find out why someone thinks something. Don't ask them why they think it. That's an interesting little thing that we'll come to later. But nevertheless, it should be something that kind of gets you curious and to explore a little, learn a little bit more. Um, I don't want us to think that it's about being skeptical about everything. It's not a pessimistic attitude, seeing things in terms of judgment. Well, I'm just, no one knows anything, and you can never know anything. You can know stuff, but I think what I'm doing is that I'm just trying to set the bar a little bit higher for knowledge because we should set the bar high. It's difficult to know something. It's difficult to have an objectively accurate view of the world, that's not based on any assumptions or things like that. That means that, again, that links back to it being respectful to people because it's difficult to achieve that. Therefore, there's no shame in falling short. There's no shame in something just being a judgment and not knowing. There's no shame in treating it as something like that. You go, good on you. That's your judgment. Good for you for actually making a judgment. You might be right. Let's have a look. So it doesn't need to be pessimistic. I actually think it's this kind of little theory I've got that it's connected to there's lots of different reasons for where our human creativity and imagination comes from I think being aware of not knowing something, knowing that you don't know something is it's going to go, hang on a minute. It's like the classic thing of, what's his name? Einstein, Newton and the apple falling, hang on a minute. I don't actually know why that apple fell. And that it caused this kind of incredibly creative way of looking at the universe that seems obvious to us now, but wasn't at all at the time. So it kind of actually sparks curiosity, imagination, and growth, and that kind of thing. But finally, it's a way of kind of instilling a nice blend of confidence but humility. And I think people will understand that that's a nice mixture to have, and you need to have that mixture. You need to have, they both need each other, because if you've got confidence but with no humility at all, very quickly turns into arrogance, overconfidence. and it's not good for thinking and decision making if you're never prepared to think that could see why you might be wrong. But at the same time, if you've got kind of lots of humility and you're always thinking about why you're right, you're wrong, and you've got no confidence at all, then you're not going to make your judgments, decisions. You're not going to offer anything out into the world. So you sort of need the two things together. And I think that thinking in terms of judgments helps you kind of create this kind of nice mixture of confidence but humility. If you say, well, it's just my opinion, that sounds quite weak, really. And I think that whereas if you say that, look, this is my judgment, this is the judgment I'd like to make here. It gives the sense that you've thought about it quite a lot, that there's almost a sort of sense of finality about it. Look, and this is where I'm standing, you know. And so I think as a kind of leader, it's a good language to use. But you're also conceding that you're fallible. It's a judgment. You're not saying that you know. So you're admitting that there's a possibility that you're wrong. So you've got that kind of confidence and humility sort of built in to the idea of judgment.
Let me get one piece on that, because I think from a leader's perspective on this last point of, listen, this is the information I have. This is the choice I've made, the judgment I've made. What that really helps kind of with the team, right? So being able to communicate your decision making process in a logical way. They may not agree with you. However, they understand how you got to where you are, and they can at least, they're not like left guessing what's going on. They're like, okay, the person may have made a lot of dumb choices to get there, but like I understand the chain of logic. And that, I think, is something that helps people get on the bus, or like, this person's crazy and I'm out of here. But the alternate is like, they're just like, this is my choice and you don't need to know why I made my choice. It's almost like a parent, it's a hierarchical thing where so I, I'm not going to dive in on that, but there's certainly benefit for being able to just communicate your decision making process to people around you. That really helps them see the world from your perspective. And I think that helps from the trust component and the certainty
Mm,
component. And yeah, as long as we get to the same outcome, and I think that's really important in all decisions, like what outcome are we trying to achieve is like another component of this, that I always boil back to. People can see the path there, that's helpful. So leader training there, that's free stuff for people.
well, yeah, and I think that's like the point about communicating your sort of reasoning and thinking, and making it something that people are more likely to sort of hopefully get on board with it, but at least sort of accept. I think that leads into the kind of final point I was going to make, which is a segue to next time, which is this idea that seeing things in, which I think I sort of mentioned last time, but this idea that seeing things more in terms of judgments, let's say, not purely in terms of judgment, but a bit more in terms of judgments, less just everything as facts or opinions, is actually good for sharing thinking as well, because like I said, the more you see things in terms of judgment, the less judgmental you become, because the less you see things as absolutes, black and whites, right and wrong. What does it mean in practice? Like, I don't set out to do this, but in practice, it tends to mean that you're taking things more out of the fact box and putting them into the judgment things. A lot of things that masquerade or are presented as being facts, you end up relegating them a little bit to us for some reason or another. There's something about it that's not quite so certain. But you also end up elevating opinions a little bit more. You're respecting them a little bit more, because you're encouraging people to think, like, if you think that's an opinion, just an opinion, okay, if we treat it as a judgment, we're giving the person respect, because we're thinking that they've actually got reasons for it. They might be right and I might be wrong. And so, in practice, that's I think what it means a little bit. The fact and opinion boxes shrink a little. They still exist. They shrink a little bit. The judgment zone grows, and probably, for different reasons. You could think of it as facts being relegated to, you know, but it helped do that process helps our communicating, as if we accept that there's a more of a grey area in between. that when someone says something that seems completely wrong, rather than just saying that's crazy, you're stupid, that's wrong, think, well, actually, it's a matter of judgment. They've probably got their reasons. It seems crazy, but I don't know what their reasons are. Let's find out what they are.
Right.
And also, what I think is a fact that that it's contradicting and therefore crazy might itself be a matter of judgment. In which case, maybe I was wrong in the first place. Hopefully, well, I say hopefully. I'm just trying not to sound too conceited, but it does help with conversation and dialogue. Trust me.
Just, I always like to add my little 2 cents on here. But if you're taking the polarization away, if you're going to bring fact and opinion closer together because people understand that it's actually more judgment, you eliminate and you start to reduce the polarization between parties. That's what I just took away from what you just said, and I know that's something a lot of people are trying to find, which is like more common ground, more ability to find those common things that we all want to kind of move towards. And especially in like, tie it back to business, tie it back to world, it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of divided people. So this skill, again, just in a workplace, I deal with a lot of engineers. They have their own thing. And it's not selling stuff. It's building amazing products and like fixing problems. So there's my workplace sales operations, sales engineering. Like we have our own facts and opinions on what's important. So as long as we're aligning towards a common goal, which is I want to sell the product, then all right, let's figure out how to do that together. And what is real in your world and real in my world probably are not as finite or
Mm,
immovable as we may think, as long as we understand that other people have different perspectives and opinions, and let's find that common ground. So that's
yeah,
what I heard in
absolutely.
what you just said. I repackage a lot of things, but that's what I took away right there.
Well, just to give people a teaser for next time, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work I did in an area which is like taking that kind of polarization even further, which is the idea of like extremism and violence and how sort of conversations between different sides that disagree with each other can actually escalate into something really nasty. I actually, when I was working with a business once, I said I was maybe going to maybe going to touch on that, this sort of preventing violent extremism, and she said, "Oh no, best keep that out of the kind of business context." I thought, oh, fair enough. Is it not really kind of very relevant? She goes, "No, it's too relevant." It's absolutely-
We got some
Yeah.
drama in this building.
So yeah, but you're absolutely right. A lot of this stuff has been inspired by that work I did and
Mhm.
how to kind of like de-escalate things. But without things just getting all wishy-washy and just saying, well, that's your opinion, that's my opinion, let's agree to differ. Because in the real world, we actually have to make decisions and we have to come together and we have to align and we have to move forward. And sometimes someone does have to admit if they're wrong and stuff like that. And so we'll be looking at how you do that in ways without it getting nasty.
I
So
love that.
yeah,
But, I'll have a lot of little sidebar comments on that too, because
okay.
I've
I
done a
look
lot
forward
of
to it.
customer service in my life, and that is a place where you're constantly in conflict and combative situations. So I'm really excited about that because I think that helps you deal with frustrated people generally. That skill. I'm really excited to get into that. So this was an awesome episode. We covered a ton of ground. I think judgment and all the other potential things between fact and opinion are so relevant. There's so many different, ways to consider how they show up. We covered a bunch of different ones in here, but if you have other topics that you want us to cover on that or examples, what I'll invite you to do is drop them in the comments. You can also just go to Joe's website, which will be down in the comments. So check that out and reach out to Joe, ask him questions. This is what he does day in and day out. You can also talk to me, the sales guy who doesn't work for Joe. We just again met on LinkedIn, and I think what he does is important. I'm happy to share my opinion, but Joe's the expert. He's able to actually teach you how to work through this. He's the shortcut. So with all that, thanks for watching or listening wherever you're getting the information, and make sure to follow, like, subscribe, and share. And that's Brian O Podcast episode 2. Thanks, Joe.